Today on the podcast, I welcome Dr. Dan Stickler, who has a pretty crazy background. He was trained in vascular surgery and did that for a while and just got sick of trying to manage people's conditions and not actually think about the root cause and how to make humans better. So he has gone really against the grain with how traditional medicine is practiced. And we recorded this at his facility, which is unlike anything I've ever seen. So he's trying to integrate all these different things that are really at the cutting edge of medicine. Obviously, physical health, yes, this is a component where a lot of people look at that, but he's also trying to bring in movement, emotional health, mental health, spiritual health. And we talk in this episode a lot about how he quantifies those things, how he measures them, and then how he tries to intervene to improve those in people's lives. Huge incorporation of genetics. And yeah, the doc is he's brilliant. He's tying a lot of things together. I don't think a lot of people are thinking this way. So it was really fascinating to sit down with Dan and chat through his methods here. So if you're trying to think about where medicine is going to be going in the next 10, 15, 20 years and how a doctor's visit is hopefully going to look, it's going to be a lot like Dan's practice and how he sets everything up. It's remarkable and it's far more individualized than just take generic labs, look at somebody in a vacuum in one system and prescribe them medications. So tune in and I hope you enjoy. This episode is brought to you by Oak Pastures, a fully regenerative farm based out of Bluffton, Georgia. If you guys don't know how obsessed I am about regenerative agriculture, you probably haven't been around listening to this podcast for a long time. This is a type of farming that mimics natural ecosystems to restore the loss of soil, biodiversity, and best of all, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. I recently actually just purchased a farm here in Texas to start learning about this myself, but White Oak has been around doing this for decades, and it shows in the research. They actually recently got a study done showing that for every pound of meat that you eat from White Oak Pastures, you're actually putting 3.5 pounds of carbon back into the soil. When you have this ecosystem where all the animals work together, you actually get carbon pulled back into the soil. Whereas the fake meat, Beyond, Impossible, et cetera, they put 4 pounds of carbon into the atmosphere. So if you're gonna really do any sort of choice for the environment or for your own health, this is the way to do it. These are the types of farms to support. I love their products, and not only their animal products, which they have a bounty of, all the way from the classic chicken, turkey, pork, and beef, but also guinea, duck, rabbit, goose, etc. I mean, this is what it takes to have a regenerative model. And you can try them all today for 20% off with code NATURALSTATE. Just head to dranthonygustin.com/meat to check out some of my favorites. I love all their products, but one of my favorite is actually a wild card here. You probably wouldn't be able to guess, but it's their beef tallow body wash, which I use daily instead of soap. So if you want to try out some of the best regenerative meat on the planet, head to dranthonygustin.com/meat and use code NATURALSTATE for 20% off your order. This show is also brought to you by Alitura Naturals. When I considered sponsors for this show, I reached out to Andy, who is the founder of Alitura, and pretty much begged him to support the show just because they are the only products that I trust to put on my skin. So much garbage is in skincare products that it blows my mind. I cannot find any other products. I do not put anything else on my body other than Alitura. It's actually a lie. I use White Oak Pastures beef tallow soap in the shower, but other than that, everything sort of pre-post around that is Alitura. And if you don't know why, your skin is the largest organ in your body. It absorbs everything you put on it. And men are less known for using sort of skincare products, but women average over 250 chemicals that are in their bloodstream from their skincare products by the time they walk out the door in the morning. That is ridiculous. I personally use the moisturizer, the clay mask in my sauna, and the Pearl cleanser. My fiance uses way more. She has a little bit more of a skincare routine than I. And the products themselves are made with the highest end ingredients that you would ever find in skincare products. This stuff's incredible. Andy himself is a testament how these products work. He's been on the podcast before to tell his story, but it was amazing. He was in a horrific accident. His face got all mangled up, and he basically made this formula to heal his scars, and he is now a male model. That is not a joke. He has incredible skin, and is obsessed with the quality of his ingredients and the sourcing of them. He was just in Hawaii recently sourcing one ingredient of the many that are in one of his products. This guy goes, visits every single farm and product, and it is incredible. The quality you get here is by far the best in the industry. And so I begged him to sponsor the show and also begged him to give you guys a little bit of a hookup. So if you use code AG20, you'll get 20% off in free shipping over at alitura.com. That's AG20 at ALITURA to get 20% off your order at alitura.com. Doc, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
You were telling me a little bit about your background and how you started in medicine, and it's very different than where you are now. So I'd love to just unpack that and sort of chat about where you started and how you got to where you are right now.
Yeah, I was always fascinated with medicine. I don't know why, but that was my background. Was from the time I was in second grade, I always told people I wanted to be a doctor. I didn't have any doctors in the family. And then by the time I was in high school, I wanted to be a surgeon. And then when I got into college, I wanted to be a neurosurgeon because I was a neuroscience major, undergraduate, and a philosophy minor, which was really unusual, but it turned out the philosophy minor was very impactful in my life. Got into medical school and was disenchanted with the whole process. Found it to be so much focused on sick care and this stepwise postponement of death over time is the role of the doctor. And I said, that's not what I thought this was about. I thought it was about helping people to live a better life in all ways. So if you're not sick, there's not a role for you in the current medical system. And I went into surgery because there was nothing else that interested me in medicine. I said, this is one area where I can intervene and bring people back to baseline at least. Then I got into weight loss surgery, which was able to take people from a lower baseline up after the surgery. But then after 10 years of doing that, I realized it was not the way to go. And kind of overlapping with that, I started doing age management medicine because it was the first time I found something that worked for people who weren't sick. And then we started developing our own program. My wife and I built on top of this. She's got a doctorate in audiology and worked in the military and human performance for 30 years. And she was kind of the subject matter expert in that area in stress and cognitive function and leadership. So we merged that into the corporation, and so we had the body in mind. So we were optimizing body, and we were optimizing mind, we were optimizing stress, and the missing piece was essentially spirit. I mean, I don't like the cliche term body, mind, spirit, but that's essentially where we went with this. And in the last 2 years, we've added these pieces regarding love and relationships, finding purpose, and really consciousness explorations, because I found so many people that were just so lost in their main issues. I mean, these highly successful people, but their main issues is they had no purpose in life, or they had no love or relationship. And we found ourselves doing a lot of that work with clients, and we really didn't have anything formal that we put together for it.
So what was the term you used earlier? Age management. Age management. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, age management was essentially started around the year 2000, where people were looking at bringing hormones to optimal levels, so youthful levels. And when I started into it in 2005, it was still looked at as kind of fringe type work, but I really loved it because it could help people that were looking to be better. And that's a role that I felt medicine should play. But they were, the age management the groups were so focused on the body and hormones, with a little bit of focus on nutrition and movement, but that was the limit of what they were doing. And it just wasn't complete for me. And we actually, with the way we interact with people, we've taken a whole new paradigm of medicine. So we don't do what's been used currently as linear thinking in medicine. So you have a cold, you go on this medication. You have a urinary tract infection, you go on this. You have heart disease, and here are your options. But it's like you're going through a flow sheet, stepwise through this thing with no thought of anything else. And we put so much credibility on experts. Oh, this guy's a cardiologist, so that's who I'm going to go to for my heart, and this guy's a nephrologist, is who I'm going to go to for my kidneys. And we ignored the people with the breadth of knowledge that could look at all of this stuff together and see how it interacted. So you go to the cardiologist, they're great if you don't die of a heart attack. They don't care if the medication they put you on, well, they care, but it's not their problem if it causes kidney issues. But they don't pay attention to the kidneys. You die of cancer and they're your cardiologist. They're like, I did my job. And this is what happens in too much value of expertise. And you need the experts. And what I say is you keep them on tap, but not on top. You keep somebody that can look from a wide breadth of knowledge to see how things interact. And this is complexity thinking, getting away from the linear model and looking at how all things interact rather than looking at just one system, one intervention.
Yeah, you talked about, even going in the physical realms of bodies, you were saying before, it's so siloed when you want to fix a problem, let alone then you're adding in mind, which we can chat about in a little bit of how you guys approach that. Mm-hmm. And then this spirit, which I know a lot of people sort of think is very fringe, but all these things should be very integrated and are all parts of health.
Yeah.
And even one of those things alone gets so fragmented. And there's a lot of great people who are doing things in this space, like you're talking about experts, but tying that all together is for sure the hardest part. If you have a complex human organism, trying to manage it through there. So, I guess when you guys are now looking through people, and we talk about this sick care management, and we think of sick as physical disease or physical unrest. How do you think of how people have gotten to this place?
Well, we got to this place because of the value of expertise, I think.
Interesting.
Because everybody's looking at individual organ systems and how we can fix that, but not paying attention to the fact that the heart is involved in feedback loops from 20 to 30 different systems. And, that's why you can do stuff that's going to increase heart rate or contractility, but it doesn't follow a linear pattern. So the more medicine you give, the more in a linear model, it should increase heart rate and contractility. But it doesn't work that way. And it's not even the sum of all the inputs. You have to look at these inputs and see how they interact, because you change one and it can change the other ones too, because they're interacting with each other. It's this complex web network. And, we've gotten to the point where we look at medical research as the human being a monoclonal model. We do this in rats. The rats are all monoclonal. They're all the same genetics. They're all raised in the same foods and the same environments. And we do studies on them and say, oh, here's what works. Well, you can't do the same with human beings. Every human being has a different context involved. You can try to match them up as best you can, but everybody has different context. And even if you look at the people from the same region, so genetically they're very similar, they're going to have very different epigenetics, so gene expressions. And so what we're pushing for right now is really taking the N of one approach with every individual. There's no perfect diet that's going to work for everybody. There's no perfect exercise that works for everybody. There's no breath technique that's going to work for everybody. What we do is we take everybody as an individual. We look at all the data on that individual and we develop probabilities. We say, probability-wise, this is the best intervention to create this outcome, or combination of interventions. And so that's the way we've been working it since about 2012.
What do you see as the most common source of people not being at baseline or preventing somebody from maybe reaching peak performance?
Yeah, so we call that unbalanced state. So we have the unbalanced state, the homeostasis state, the optimized state, and then the enhanced state. So in the unbalanced state, they've got some system disruption. And what we do is we may identify, okay, they have diabetes. Well, the treatment is not to go in and put them on insulin or metformin or something like that. It's more, okay, how are you sleeping? What's your stress like? Let's look at the nutrition a little bit more in depth and kind of match it with your genetics and see how close we can get to this and monitor that over time. We change their exercise patterns that are individualized for each person to optimize the outcome for that individual. When we move them up into homeostasis and suddenly their system's ready to take on things. And then we can work with lifestyle patterns and some lifestyle interventions to move them into an optimized state through epigenetics. We know what will affect that, certain bionutrients and certain lifestyle factors that are going to enhance the expressions of genes. And then we have the enhanced state. So once they're optimized, then we can move them into an area where, prior times it wasn't possible to enhance the human state. And some people see that as too much transhumanism. But for me, if we can enhance the human state and we have the abilities to do it, why wouldn't we? If you could improve someone's intelligence, why would we not consider that? I mean, you want to solve most of the world problems. It starts with improving intelligence, improving empathy, improving these aspects of the human that can reason through that. And you don't want to rely on computers that don't have those characteristics. So it's the best way to do it is to really enhance the human in performance, in cognitive performance, in physical performance, in, EQ, all of that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting model of how you think about this from a stage-based outcomes measure. The way I think about it is even when you're looking at physical health, mental health, spiritual health, generally people seem to get off track most because the environment is a huge mismatch to the genes.
Right.
So how do you guys think about, is it mostly nutrition? Is it just living in a city? What are the major inputs that get people off track and push them into an unbalanced state?
Yeah, I mean, you notice this, like if you travel to a foreign country and you're eating a different type of food, that your intestines don't do real well with it. It's because the body is constantly adapting to environment. So when you are in a specific environment, your microbiome is adjusted perfectly to that environment. Your respiratory system, your immune system, all of that is keyed in for that environment. That's where you spend your time. You also have the ancestry component of that. So all the ancestors prior to you and the environment that they interacted with is coded in the epigenetics. This is transgenerational epigenetics. And so you've got some programming of that. So it's good to know the context of somebody, if they were an Inuit Eskimo that lived in the Aleutian Islands, and that's their ancestry, moving them into New York City and putting them on a Italian style diet of pasta and pizza, they're not going to do well because they're geared to be in an environment where the nutrition is about 80% fat. And so it's a mismatch to them. And you can change things in that regard from making some efforts to shift the epigenetics, but there's some aspects of that you need to stick with. And that's why nutritionally, we look at their genetic data and we say, probability-wise, this is a diet that will give you the best outcome. And then we set up ways to measure whether it's working or not over time.
Yeah, I've always thought it would be really cool to build an interface connecting like 23andMe data to some sort of nutritional database.
Yeah.
Or even temperature and things like that, sun exposure, et cetera, to see your genetics and how they plug into a natural environment.
Yeah.
And not only that, but a seasonal environment. I mean, this is another big thing that I think that we expect to eat the same things every day, every year, over and over and over again. And even I think that most people can help a lot of their health if they just eat local and live local.
Yeah.
I think it solves a lot of problems, but like you said, some people, it's just, it doesn't work that well if their genes are completely mismatched with their environment.
Yeah.
So it'd be really interesting. I'm sure you guys do this on an individual basis, but like a simple tool would be really cool to have.
Yeah, and this is what we've got 400 coaches worldwide that we've trained in epigenetics. So it's 90 hours of training that we put them through, and then we evaluate their ability to read genetics and use epigenetics to guide people. The local aspect is a really interesting concept because we've been kind of studying this for many years. And there's what exosomes are, the little fat globules that cells secrete that have like microRNAs, RNAs, and proteins in them that they send out and goes around the body to other cells. What we've found is that those are essentially messengers from other cells. So what another cell is experiencing in the environment, it's sending a message throughout the body to say, hey, this is what's going on, and this is what you need to do to optimize your function in this environment, like a high stress environment, a high heat environment. Whatever it is, the cells are signaling that. And the fact of the matter is we are not individuals in an environment. We are individuals of an environment, and we interact with everything in that environment. I mean, every breath we take, our cells are assessing what's going on in the environment and making adaptive changes to optimize the function in that environment. And the local aspect is interesting because microRNAs that come in these exosomes are ubiquitous in nature, and they're very old. They're very short segments of RNA that are phylogenetically very old. So they're in the early time of the family trees. And we share microRNAs with plants. We share them with animals. And so think about the fact that if you're eating a steak from a feedlot in, Northern California, and you're living in Austin, well, you've got the stress of the animal messages are being put into the meat. You've got the environment that they're in, the messages are being put into the meat. So you're getting a misinformation coming in. If you eat local, one of the theories is that even with plants or with local meats, you're going to get an assessment of what that local environment is actually doing. So it's just like when we take honey from local farms, we are less likely to have allergies to the pollens because we're getting low doses, hormetic doses of that. But the epigenetics are saying, hey, this is an environment where this is predominant, so we need to make some changes.
Yeah, super interesting. So as far as, I think there's just a lot of controversy right now around what you can actually extrapolate from the research right now from epigenetics and even genetics in general. There's a lot of just associative results. So how do you guys parse through the evidence and make absolute recommendations on somebody based upon sort of the...
Well, that's the great thing about epigenetics is you can look at epigenetics and you can see how certain things change epigenetics. Like if you exercise for 6 months, you can change expressions of 7,000 genes. I mean, that's a third of our genome in a very positive way. So it'll lower inflammatory markers. It increases metabolic markers. You can take extra virgin olive oil and the monounsaturated fats along with the phytosterols have a specific impact on epigenetic expression, which can be determined in the lab. Fish oil the same way. But you hear the reports that come out in the same week that fish oil is great for you, and then fish oil is useless calories in another one. But it's because they're looking at a mixture of individuals that have different contexts. I mean, you have a guy sitting on a sofa eating Big Macs and potato chips and has no activity. Fish oil is not going to do much for that person. But you have somebody who's athletic that's looking for performance, and fish oil will do a great deal for them. So you have to look at the context of the individual. What we know from epigenetics is what actually happens inside the cells when they see these different inputs into them. Whether it be a bionutrient or a lifestyle pattern, it will change that. Even sleep has a profound impact on epigenetic expression. And these are all things that we can deduce from the research, even just the laboratory cellular research, which we don't need to have because we'll be misguided when we do these large population studies. But it's not that they're useless. It's just that these large population studies should be used as a gauge to say, hey, this is what we should look at and see what's happening with it, but we don't do it that way.
Interesting. So as far as if somebody wanted to work with a coach, what would the process be? Is 23andMe as it is now good enough? Do they need to go somewhere else to get a full sequence? How do you guys approach?
Well, it's interesting. Most people are actually going away from full sequencing, whole genome sequencing, because we just don't know much about it. And when you get it, if you look at the number of mutations in your genes and in a whole genome sequencing, it will freak you out. It's pretty scary stuff because there's a lot of mutations in there. But 99.999% of those are really uneventful because the body's turned them off or whatever it's done to protect it. But you get the report of all this nasty stuff that's happening. 23andMe, Ancestry, and our Apeiron genetic tests, we only look at what's called single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are not mutations. And, I hear a lot of health coaches and functional medicine docs online that will talk about these as mutations, like ApoE mutation or the MTHFR mutation. And it's really misinformation because those aren't mutations. They are adaptations in gene inheritance or these base pair inheritances that are designed to optimize for the environment. So people look and they say, oh, I have all these symptoms. And then somebody looks and they says, oh, you've got MTHFR, homozygous, and I know how to fix that. I'm going to put you on folate, and nothing, it doesn't work, or it works, but it's because of something else that they did. MTHFR is actually, when we look at it in the United States environment, it's a mismatch. So that homozygous MTHFR creates, because we have a low folate intake. We have folic acid, which doesn't work very well with that, but we have a low methylated folate intake, and that's from fresh vegetables. And with that double homozygous, it's actually really beneficial to have that when you're in a folate-rich environment. So it's actually a gene that was really optimized in the African region because they had high folate intake. Even they look now, even people that don't eat a lot of food, they still have a lot of folate intake in that environment. And what that codes for is that gives them the ability to have reduced cancer rates when they're taking high folate. Babies that are in the womb that are a homozygous MTHFR, if the mother's taking high folate intake, they have a much greater survival chance. But we only look at the negative side of these things. ApoE, which is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, can be very significant. But if you have that variant that gives you the increased risk, you also have some protection against viral illness. And again, this was one that came out of the African area where people just didn't get exposed to a lot of high saturated fat intake. They got exposed to a lot of viruses that could kill them. And so they evolved to carry that ApoE variant that was beneficial for the viruses. But when you get into an environment where you take in a lot of saturated fat and you're not, or you're very sedentary, then you increase your risk of Alzheimer's because of that variant that you carry.
Right. So much like a sickle cell being protected from malaria, things like
exactly.
that.
Yeah.
So when you guys look at SNPs, how is that different from these?
So the SNPs, that is the 0.3% of our genetic code that makes everyone different. So 99.7% of our genetic code, mine and yours, are identical. Same with everybody in the world. We're that much identical. That's that 0.3% that makes each of us an individual and gives us characteristics that are different from somebody else. And that's what we want to look at, because those are the things that can guide the lifestyle patterns for people to match them with the kind of genes that they've inherited.
Yeah. So how are some of the recommendations tactically? How do they look like?
Well, we have an online platform that we load them up to. So we have an 85-page report that goes through nutrition, supplementation, sleep, then into environmental health and detoxification. Then we go into athletic performance, and then we go into hormones. We also just launched a neurotransmitter panel, it's an enormous panel. And then we have an endocannabinoid response panel, so we can look at your genetics and see how you respond to different THC and CBDs. And
what are you seeing there? Because this is a thing where I have always been extremely sensitive to any sort of THC intake. Uh-huh. And is it just either too much or not enough receptors, and so the receptors get overloaded, or
it varies? I mean, there's different receptor responses. There's different stress responses that can occur with them. Our panel was developed by a researcher in North Carolina. He was one of our students, and he was fascinated by the difference in responses that he was seeing with people. So he actually developed the panel, and we worked with him to get it launched.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Cool. So you have all these things. Obviously, you're quantifying a lot around physical health.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the hormone side of things, does that sort of guide a lot of your recommendations? And do you guys work with a lot with peptides, hormones, things like that?
Yeah. I mean, the genetics gives us another context to look at everything. So we look at the genetics, we look at the lab work, we look at their muscle mass, we look at their fat mass, we look at their, well-being scores, quality of life. And we use all that data to come up with an idea of where that person is. Because you can't, people will frequently try to use one thing, and this is the linear model where they'll use one thing to determine where somebody is. I mean, that's just like that MTHFR I was talking about. Somebody's homozygous for that, and they may have some symptoms, but the first thing they want to do is put them on methylfolate, and it can be actually highly detrimental. It can make things worse. So you want to look at other aspects like the labs. You can look at homocysteine levels, and if the homocysteine levels are normal, it doesn't matter how bad their methylation is, they're doing something right there. So we use that to determine things, and then we look at their hormone levels. And what we do is we try to normalize the hormones to a youthful state, because the body, when the hormones are youthful, gets the signal that you are youthful, and so it responds in that way. As we age, which is a programmed component of our DNA, is for us to age and die, it gradually makes our system less resilient, and all the cells start sending out these signals that you're older. This is why, parabiosis, where they hooked the old rat and the young rat's circulation together, and the old rat got younger because it was getting signals that it was younger.
Yeah, the old blood boy technique.
Yeah. And there was a company out of San Francisco called Ambrosia, which was drawing off plasma from students and infusing it into old patients, and they were getting some rejuvenation with it. And a lot of companies are pursuing this right now, but what we're really trying to do is identify what those factors are in the plasma, and we can manufacture them and then use them.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. So how often do people go on like a hormone replacement therapy? I mean, if that's a natural thing that happens and there's, let's say, some natural curve to that, do you think that's necessary to sort of artificially increase that curve? If
they want to. I mean, if their goal is to feel more youthful and to experience life, a more full life, and not go through the process of aging in the natural way, which, aging is natural, but it's not healthy. That's up to them. And so we deal with clients that are really the people that are wanting to maintain youthful cognitive function, youthful physical function, and well-being for as long as they can. So we do try to normalize it.
So before we started chatting, we saw a little bit of how you quantify the mental side of things in the mind. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of quantification, obviously, in the physical side of things. I mean, we're sort of in an excessive amount, I think, and a focus on that day to day. We have all these wearables, we can track all this stuff, even sleep. But how do you guys think about quantifying? We'll start with the mind and then also talk about spirit as well.
Well, I think the quantified self is where medicine is going to go over this decade. Everything is going to be about developing new wearable technologies that can be instantaneously monitoring. I can remember watching the movie The Island a couple of years ago, when the guy would pee in the toilet and then it would come up with recommendations of what vitamins and stuff that he needed. And I was like, oh, okay, this is where we're going. And it is. I mean, we're getting to the point where we get instantaneous feedback on things. I mean, our wearable watches that we give all of our clients, they're the Phoenix 6s from Garmin, and they're incredible. I mean, I can look at their daily resting heart rate, their daily stress levels in HRV. I can look at their daily body battery to see how they're recovering from exercise. I look at their activities and how they're doing in the activity. What peak heart rate did they get to? Are they actually training for VO2, which is their goal? And it's hard for people to kind of figure all that stuff out on their own. But that's what our coaches are good at, is they understand biometric data and they understand how to incorporate that into a plan for somebody and how to monitor it over time. And this is where I think a lot of the health coaching is going to go, is in how we can maximize client outcomes through instantaneous biofeedback.
Do you think that is going to be just way easier as we get more technology and wearables?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's one of the largest, fastest growing markets, and the highest investment markets right now are in these wearables. So age rejuvenation, pharmaceuticals and strategies, along with the interventions that are going to allow assessment in a much deeper way.
So what about as far as the mind part of it.
Yeah.
And you walked me through and we saw a little example of somebody getting one of these.
So, the brain, we do QEEG brain mapping. We do a clinical grade QEEG brain map, and then we read that for performance. The reason we do that is because the databases that your brainwave data is compared to is what's called a normative database. And that would be something I would never want to be told, is that I had a normal brain, because it means I'm average across the board with everybody else.
Kind of like a reference range in a lab panel that's taken from sick people who are going to the hospital.
Exactly. Yeah. And what we do is we read for performance. So we do a bunch of cognitive testing. We do lifestyle assessments to find out what their level of function is. And we look at which abnormal patterns in the brain are their gift that's giving them the ability to perform exceptionally versus what is actually interfering with them. And then we can plan out interventions based on what we see.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in mental health. I think that we're starting to, as a society, focus a little bit more on this. We see the bricks being laid, I think, about looking at this a little bit more clearly. But the focus on depression and anxiety via being treated with psilocybin, ketamine, et cetera. But I still think we're a little far away from having accepted ways to actually measure it. I mean, this is one of those things where I think we'll get there rather soon, but we're very rudimentary in being able. It's like pre-blood work, pre any of these other things, pre-genetics, that looking at mental health and saying, okay, here's what an ideal state is for you. Here's how we can measure that you have any problems. Here's how we can get you back there. So, I mean, how do you see that beyond what you have going, like the future?
Well, we have to be careful because, there's a big push right now in the psychedelics to find the magic intervention that's going to cure the depression, cure the anxiety. And there's never a single answer for anything. I mean, you can get a benefit from it. I'm the medical director for Neurohacker Collective, and we develop a lot of cognitive-based supplements. And it was funny when I first got introduced to Daniel Schmachtenberger, who was one of the founders. He was the first person in the supplementation industry that ever looked at anything from a complex system standpoint. He looked at, okay, how we can upregulate cognitive function, which most people will go for the Adderall or one of the other cognitive like modafinil to boost their brain function. But they don't think about things like, okay, well, if we're increasing metabolism in the brain, which is what happens with this, and the brain's already taking up 20% of our metabolism, how do we make sure we have enough raw material being supplied as precursors? How do we mitigate the free radicals that are generated from the increased metabolism? How do we support the system with cofactors? And I was just blown away by that. I mean, nobody had looked at how the goal is to improve cognitive function, but to look at all those inputs that feed into that. I mean, it just blew me away. And then they asked me to be their medical director, and I was all over it because this was somebody who was doing the supplement industry like we were doing in the medical industry.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting now to see some of these protocols coming out, and especially with ketamine, I think it's a little bit more mature since it's legal, but the therapy is just very subjective. And I think that once we're able to quantify some of these things, we're going to really accelerate a lot of.
Yeah, we see a lot of different reactions with the ketamine. Some people are super sensitive, and some people just don't feel anything at all with the ketamine. And what I'm talking about is we use the intranasal ketamine prior to doing brain stimulation protocols or biofeedback protocols because it upregulates neuroplasticity in the brain. So the learning and memory of what we're kind of introducing into the brain gets uptaken very quickly.
Yeah.
And we have some people that can't do 2 sprays. They have to do 1 spray, and they're still kind of loopy on that, but it wears off very quickly, and they're able to improve dramatically over a short period of time.
So for people who maybe aren't aware of what neurofeedback or biofeedback is and how this can help, I'd love for you maybe to break that down a little bit.
Yeah, so biofeedback is looking at mostly at the stress response of the system in our clinic. So we look at how the system behaves in response to stress. And with that, we can look at, do they Do they vasoconstrict? So do their hands get cold during stressful situations? Do they sweat more? Do they increase their heart rate? Do they tank on their HRV? Do they have muscle tension? Do they really dump their CO2? And what we can do is identify those cues, which most of them are unaware of, but then we can train that specific cue so they become anti-fragile with stress. And this is different than resilient. Resilient is you can face stress and bounce back from it. Anti-fragile is you face stress and you come out stronger on the other side. And that's our goal with the biofeedback piece. Now, on the brain piece, what we're doing there, we used to do neurofeedback, but we found that, it would take a lot of sessions with neurofeedback, and it's extremely boring. I mean, you've got to do like 40 sessions where you stare at a screen and you're flying a plane or something like that. And only when your brain gets into that key pattern will the plane fly. So it's giving you reward. And it was tedious work, and the clients just didn't like it. And we found neurostimulation where we use AC current, DC current, transcranial magnetic, and global PEMF. And we can introduce patterns into the brain. By introducing the pattern, the brain learns that it's a valuable pattern for them to be in.
Interesting. So you do like an assessment, say, okay, here are the patterns that are working for them currently in peak state, and then match those and sort of.
Yeah, and that's what we do is we do the QEEG first, and we map that out. And, we read that based on a protocol for what they're wanting to achieve. So they want to achieve more relaxation. They want to achieve better sleep. They want to achieve more rapid decision making. They want better meditation. I mean, it's amazing the protocols that are out there on neurostimulation that you can introduce into the brain, and doing them based on the individual's outcome that they want, plus their baseline brainwave pattern. And with neurostimulation, we'll do 2-a-day sessions for 5 days, so a total of 10 sessions that are 20 minutes long each, and we're getting massive results, better than 40 neurofeedback sessions.
Are these just putting specific frequencies through the brain, or what?
Yeah, we're targeting the 3-dimensional aspects of the brain, so we can target, the limbic system. We can target, like the nucleus accumbens if we want to be very specific. We can do a global stimulation, which actually upregulates all aspects of the brain. The protocols are pretty diverse, and pretty much whatever you're looking for, there's a protocol for. There's a smoking cessation one that you can program in.
And is there any technology that's readily accessible for people at home on this yet, or is it?
It's coming. I mean, there's a couple of neurostimulations. The only one we use for home is called the David. The David device is an audiovisual entrainment device, but they also have a neurostim device now that you can program. But it's really best to have a QEEG to see what your brainwave patterns are, so you know what you're putting in there before you just go and start buying one that says, hey, this will improve sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, because I know there's Dream, I think, is a company who's... Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's just like a generic here.
Yeah, there's about a dozen of them on the market right now.
Interesting. Not as effective.
There's just, it's like going to the gym and training versus going to the gym and training on a high dose of steroids. That's the difference in the clinical version of what we're using in the office versus what can be done at home. Just
going for a little jog or a little thing on your Peloton versus...
I mean, they work. They do.
It's better than nothing.
Right.
Probably, but not what a...
I mean, the Halo device for sports, I mean, that's a neurostimulation, and it's stimulating the motor cortex. Yeah. And it does work.
Interesting. And then as far as the biofeedback, so you mentioned it was... basically you're retraining different pathways to triggers, almost like a subconscious pattern that you're...
Yeah, we see really amazing physiology in certain individuals that we work with. So like we have one of the world champion poker players, and you talk about somebody who can manage emotions and stress. He's able to just crush it on this device because he will elevate all of his stress response during an acute stressor, and then he's straight back to baseline as soon as he comes out. We've also seen that in some of our special forces soldiers that are highly successful. They're able to do that as well. And one of the first ones we saw was a woman who's a VP at Google. That's one of our clients, and she just had such control over her autonomic response. It was unreal. And it showed us that it can be trained in. It's not something that you're just naturally born with.
Yeah. And I think that the sort of thought process right now of classic psychology is more either that it's an innate thing or it was an environmental thing that you picked up from some trauma in the past and it's not changeable. Maybe with 40 years of therapy, you'll release some of this stuff, yeah. But it sounds like you guys have a much better approach.
I mean, you think about it, almost every cell in our body turns over completely every 6 months. I mean, we are a entirely new human being every 6 months. And to think that we are locked into something that can't change is just insane. I mean, we've seen people go through ketamine journeys that came out as a completely different person. I mean, they love the life that they've come into after a ketamine journey. I mean, it's a massive change in a very short period of time in some people.
Are these infusions more so? Or
no, we found, the infusions typically don't have very good outcomes. Most people don't feel great with the infusions. There's a few people that have really amazing responses with infusions, but what we found is that the intramuscular version has given us almost 100% positive effect.
Interesting. Is the experience the same for the patient?
No, it's different. Even with a bolus dose on the IV, they don't tend to go full dissociation as quickly as they do with the IM, because it's like the IM for some reason. It's just, we use doses on the higher side of it, and we also do a lot of set and setting work with them. So we'll spend an hour and a half prior to the journey sitting talking with them about what they're going to experience, what they want to work on, and how they can navigate the experience. And then we give them the injection as we sit and watch with them. And then they come out about an hour later, and then we spend the next 2 to 4 hours doing integration work with them, just letting them talk through the experience and how it did that. Most of the ketamine clinics right now are just, you go in, you get your IV. If you start moving too much, they crank it up. That's the other thing. You can't move when you got the IV in. With the intramuscular, you can move. And some people do like to move. I mean, hand mudras are the most amazing thing. People who have no idea what a hand mudra is are doing hand mudras during ketamine.
What is this? What is a hand mudra?
That's just the movements with the hands that are very flowy and artistic. I mean, they'll put their hands in prayer position on their chest. And they're like, well, I'm not even religious. I don't understand why I'm doing that. But it seems to be a consistent pattern that we see with ketamine.
Interesting. So the duration's the same with the IM versus the IV. It's just a very different experience.
Yeah, it takes you up faster than what we've seen with IV. And then it holds you there, and then it drops off fairly rapidly at about 40 minutes. Some people will go an hour, but most people it's almost on the clock at 45 minutes.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, integration work I think is one of the most important things where some of these clinics are opening up. We're talking about legalization of this in a lot of states. Psilocybin's coming. MDMA is coming shortly after that.
Yeah.
I think that the prep, set and setting, integration afterwards is going to be the most important thing that's focused on that. I can see a system being popularized that's more about just making money, which will in turn, just like the rest of our healthcare system, prioritize how many people can we get in these chairs, how many people can we go and churn people through. And that's what makes me a little nervous about it.
Yeah. And there are groups that are coming out with this. So right now, I know there's, can't remember the name of it. There's a group out of California that they've got this, this kind of franchise model that they're building on these ketamine and psilocybin, waiting for it to come in, and investors are investing like crazy. And I mean, huge investment in it, but it's it's kind of like when cataract surgery came out and you had all the, what we call the cataract cowboys that were out there just cranking through cataracts, and they had a assembly line process. And a lot of these clinics are doing that right now, but there's a big movement, especially a group here in Austin that are friends of ours. They're opening Kuya in about 3 months, I think, 2 months. But it's up next to the Onnit gym. And this is it's an experience like I've never heard of before. So we're on their board and we've been helping them with that. But Dan Engel, who is probably the world expert in psychedelics, he's a neurologist and psychiatrist. He's leading the clinical team there. And they've got it set up. I mean, they're using salt baths, they're using infrared. They have the set and setting for the journeys that they're going to be working with people. They have psychologists and psychiatrists on staff. I mean, this is going to be a very top end type of facility to go into, and this is what you've got to really look for when you're looking to do this kind of work. I mean, if you're looking for, purely, clinical psychotherapy work, I mean, they're going to do that too, but those are pretty sterile environments. Right. And so it just depends on what you're looking for. I mean, if it's purely just this depression that you're trying to resolve, psychotherapy works great. If it's marital counseling, I mean, MDMA therapy, I mean, it was used 500,000 times before they took it off the market in 1984. 500,000 therapy sessions, and the therapists were raving about it. They even went to court over it, and the judge said, yes, you guys, it should not be a Schedule I, and we should have this available. But I think it was the FDA that blocked it from going anywhere from the court. And so it's maintained its Schedule I status. And now we're seeing the data. I mean, the MAPS stage 3 trial with the MDMA is outstanding. I mean, they're about 70% done with the trial right now. But it's going to crush every pharmaceutical when it comes to anxiety, depression, PTSD. I mean, the numbers are irrefutable.
Yeah. Good old war on drugs, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just interesting to think. I think recency bias is as far as like I look at this year specifically, and it's very black or white. You either have one idea or another idea. And it seems to be that actually was happening much longer time ago as well, whereas it's either a drug or it's not. Yeah. And it's just a strange human thing where we don't really look into nuance that much and see how it can be applied and targeted in different ways.
Well, in MDMA, I mean, it's such a beautiful drug. It's an empathogen. I mean, it puts you in a state of love. It's not a sexual thing. It's not a psychedelic. It doesn't alter your perceptions of things. It puts you in a state of love. And what happened was people were using it recreationally. And the recreational stuff, when you get the Molly or the ecstasy, you're looking at stuff that's going to be laced with methamphetamine most of the time. That's the most common contaminant in it. But it's because MDMA is not the best thing for partying. It actually relaxes you and puts you into, you just want to do the cuddle puddles. I don't know if you've ever seen people that are at a house where they're just trying some MDMA for the evening, but they just want to lay around and just hold each other. It's nothing sexual. It's just a connection, a human connection. And you don't have that excitatory aspect that's laced into the Molly and the ecstasy. So the raw stuff is really beautiful. And I didn't understand why they took it off the market in the first place. I mean, they could have just made it a drug because, I mean, MDMA is freely available just about anywhere here in the United States. I mean, people access it all the time. So it didn't really curb that in any way, but it did remove it from the therapeutic aspects, which is where it has just this incredible outcome.
Yeah, and I think a lot of suppression of these things too lead to risk in having adulterated compounds, having the Molly and the ecstasy where it is laced with all these other things. When you push things underground, that's what you get.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like alcohol. You look at the kids in France that grow up on alcohol, there's not much of an alcoholism problem. But when it's made taboo and stay away from it, kids are fascinated by it and they want to go in that world and find out what this thing is that they can't access.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that also taking out of a therapeutic setting, if you are lucky right now and you're in you experiment with some of these things, you can have a good experience. If you have this, proper set and setting, somebody to walk you through, explain to you, hey, it's what to expect, chat with you afterwards. If you don't have that, I could just imagine people saying, oh, this should cure my depression. This should be good for that. Mm-hmm. And coming out the other side, being so much more confused than when they went in.
Yeah. And that's the integration piece that's missing in a lot of this. But I mean, all of the psychedelics are pretty amazing. I mean, psilocybin, a single big dose of psilocybin is the best thing for addiction. I mean, I've seen people that have gone through a high dose of psilocybin that were smokers that came out and never wanted another cigarette. People who drank alcohol who just decided they didn't want to drink alcohol at all anymore. And they had no withdrawals. They just kind of went through it. And these are anecdotal experiences, but still yet to hear of somebody that has those kind of events with this stuff, it makes you say, well, what's going on here? And, we've had some talks with Gul Dolan, who runs one of the psychedelic research labs at Johns Hopkins. And she's been working with MDMA and autistic kids because they're finding that MDMA is opening up social developmental programming for a 2-week period after a single dose of MDMA. And imagine that as adults, our social developmental program is pretty much closed off at 15. So we're functioning with social development that developed by the time we were 15 years old, and we're stuck with it. But with a dose of MDMA, you can open that training up again for a 2-week period. And it's beautiful that you can actually reprogram your social development during that.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people who are purists get a little upset that some of these things are, quote unquote, drugs, unnatural. But I mean, even if there is a moderate risk, the amount of benefit you can get some of these times is I would say out risk.
And as George Church says, he's the head of genetics at Harvard, and he said, human beings are the most unnatural thing on the planet right now. And so, the whole idea of natural versus synthetic, I think we need to dispatch with, because you've got to start looking at everything as an input to our system. Mm-hmm. Our environment is an input. Medication is an input. A supplement is an input. That's why I really like peptides, because it's an input the body's familiar with. But supplements and medications are unfamiliar. So you're going to get on-target effects and off-target effects with those. With peptides, you've got a very specific on-target effect. I mean, it's a laser effect going in.
Very much lock and key mechanism.
Exactly.
Yeah. So as far as how do you guys integrate now this spiritual component into treating the individual?
Yeah, the spiritual component it's so funny how.
I guess before we get into that, how would you define in this word spiritual in this context?
Well, and see, that's the problem, is it's so subjective for everybody. My concept of spiritual, it's interesting. I just did a podcast interview with Shelley Joy, Dr. Shelley Joy. She was a physicist and an electrical engineer that went through some psychedelics. She's actually from Austin originally. Went through some psychedelic experiences back in the 60s and decided that she wanted to pursue consciousness. And so she went to California Institute of Integral Studies, got her PhD there. But she's got the mathematics and physics background along with the electrical engineering background, that she looks at consciousness from both the science and the metaphysics standpoint. And one of the things that she stated, which I've always resonated with, is that the brain is not where consciousness, the brain doesn't create the epiphenomenal event of consciousness. It's not capable of doing that. Despite the fact that most people will say, and the consciousness originates from the wet meat in our head. What they're finding, when you look at quantum physics, we've measured matter down to 10 to the negative 15th meters, which is the Higgs boson particle, which we just discovered with that massive CERN accelerator. But the smallest level of matter, where matter comes to an end, is 10 to the minus 35th meters. So we've got 10 to the minus 20th meters of layers in this, and to think about all of that electromagnetic spectrum that can fit in there and how that's interacting with the human body. I mean, this is the whole thing about string theory. I mean, string theory has 11 dimensions. We can't imagine anything beyond 4 or 3 even for some people. But, you know, when time and space fold on each other in these lower dimensions, I mean, you've got some freaky stuff going on. And it just, the evidence is so strong of the way matter interacts with this underlying consciousness of the universe. And I think we're truly just like a cell phone that's having a local node experience on this web of consciousness.
Right. Yeah, I think that what's really strange about where we're living right now is that growing up, I think far more people were religious. Mm-hmm. And when I talk to friends, they kind of have a similar experience where, you know, we're pushed so much into this didactic point of view, and evidence must be proven. And so, like, when I was really young, I was raised Catholic and dismissed it when I read a Bible, like this like children's Bible when I was like 7. Mm-hmm. My grandpa gave me. I was like, this is all bullshit. Like, what, you're telling me this has actually happened? Like, no, I discard this, and I firmly plant that I am not religious from this point forward. Became very atheistic, and then now I think that so many people my age have like gone through that pattern and are now searching for something that, you know, we ripped down religion but didn't replace it with anything. Mm-hmm. And I think that served a function for us for many hundreds of generations where we needed to make sense of things. And now, you know, we haven't replaced that with anything, with new evidence and new sort of point of views. And I don't think that we have all the answers right now about what that looks like, but I think we have better answers now than we did 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. I think it's okay to update, you know, your operating system and how you think about things, but living the middle ground where there's just nothing, I think just leads to really weird behavior patterns.
It's miserable. Yeah. I mean, you know, even the psilocybin research, studies they did at MIT, they worked with terminally ill patients, and they found that after a single dose of psilocybin, they realized that death is not death. And I mean, this was done back in the Greek mystery schools at Eleusis. That's really documented well in the new book, Immortality Key. I mean, they were using psychedelics, and they would say, when you walked into the temple at Eleusis, you would walk out and know you would never die. And that's what they were talking about, is these experiences. And people will say, well, you know, these are chemicals that are altering the brain function, so it's allowing you to have this magical thinking and stuff. But I can tell you on some of the psychedelic experiences like that I've done, I went to Peru and did ayahuasca, and I've done some ketamine. You have experiences in there that you can't explain. There's no way for this physical form that I am to explain it. Mm-hmm. And I can't even understand what it is, but I experienced it. Some people can refer to it as, you know, talking with God. I mean, the people who do the 5-MeO DMT, I mean, it truly will shoot you into a conversation with God immediately. And whatever your belief system is really going to layer onto that. But there's some things that you just can't ever explain. And if the brain is where all of this originates, it has to have some context. You can't create original thought from the brain. You can piece together things to create an original idea, but you have to have previous experience of some sort to relate it to. And so to have an experience that is completely unrelatable and unexplainable really opens you up to the idea that consciousness is something outside of the body, not in it.
How do you guys recommend people in between these peak experiences? Yes, you have the integration afterwards, but it seems like it's really challenging for a lot of people to maintain that perspective throughout. It's like, I sort of liken it to you kind of have this removal. It's like you get shot into space and you look down on the earth. Yeah. And then gradually you go back and back and back, and then you get into the trenches day to day, and all you can see is what's around you. And until you're shot back into space, you have
right. They're like
forget that
serial seekers. They've got to go back to do it again rather than spend the time to integrate what they've gone through. And you know, this is a critical piece. I mean, truly, we spend 2 to 4 hours after a ketamine experience for our patients to help them to integrate this. I mean, we don't influence their experience, but we help them to figure out ways to dissect it and what it means to them, and give them ways that they can start incorporating this. And then we follow up with them to make sure that it's something that they're putting together. I mean, we don't do a lot of these. We only do these for our long-term clients, and we don't have we don't keep a lot of clients active in our clinic, but we are able to spend the time. I mean, I'm on a call with them every month, so I'm able to actually see what's happening with them, and they are free to call me anytime if they get into some existential crisis over something that they've discovered, and so you've got to have that support that's there. I mean, and the group things, are kind of, I don't know what I quite think about those, because this is the importance of set and setting. When you're in a group, there's a tendency to take on other people's stuff in the group. I think you have got to get to the point where you master the self before you start getting into group stuff. I know, socially people love to do the group stuff. This isn't about a social event. This is about working on you, getting to the point where I like the philosophy of growing up and waking up. There's a lot of people who are woke that are not grown-ups. There's a lot of people who are grown up that aren't woke. It's putting the two together. I mean, the waking up is really stepping away from the ego, the growing up is stepping away from the ego, where the waking up is more psychospiritual growth. And you've got to have both of those.
How do people get that without some of these compounds? It's just our environment.
It can be done in many ways. I mean, people get in that in meditation. Right. People can get into it in walking in the environment. I mean, to think that we have to have these medications to access this stuff, we don't. I mean, there are techniques. I mean, the Buddhists have been doing it for years, and it takes them a long time.
Right. Yeah, I also think it's like, how much are you willing to deviate from the mean as far as your environment? Like if you live in a typical American city, and you have friends who know nothing else since that point in time of like when they've grown up and also been in traditional society. Yeah, you don't even know that's an option. Right. And so you have some of these things like maybe a Headspace or Waking Up app where you start getting into meditation, but it's obviously a much faster route for these people.
Yeah, it's definitely the accelerated coursework.
But like you said, like it's not even until you experience something. A lot of times, it's not even an option.
Right. And you don't see it as an option. You don't even know that it's possible. The saying I love is, when you jump into the ocean for the first time, it doesn't matter whether you believe in water or not. Right. You're in the experience. And this is what happens. I mean, I've had people that were hardcore scientific minds like myself. I mean, I can tell you 2 years ago, I gave a talk at Future Frontiers here in town. And my wife and I were on stage and we were talking about epigenetics and psychedelics. And my wife was retiring from the military about 9 months after that. So she was 30 years in the military. She was a colonel. And, there was no chance of doing anything psychedelic. I mean, they test you all the time. And, we had gone to Peru and done some ayahuasca long ago, but back in 2012. And it was a transformative experience. But then I gradually came back into to say, and that was my mind making shit up. It was just something I created. But we started working with some of the other psychedelics after she retired, in our personal growth. And that's where things changed. So I'm at this talk and I'm on stage and I'm saying, listen, get rid of these stories around this stuff. These plants and these animals develop these toxins to keep you from eating them. And it's not some gift from Mother Nature to create some exceptional experience for you. It's a chemical reaction that's occurring in your brain. Well, a lot of these people were like psychonauts and psychedelic explorers, so it didn't go over very well. My wife was like, but there's also so she kind of mitigated it. But then after my experience, I think I'm a good person to actually talk about it, because I was so far on the extreme of the proof and the science and what this means. But I've had people that have gone through this that are just the most hardcore polymath scientists you've ever met. And they come out of a ketamine experience and they're like, holy shit, I had no idea. And it sends them into existential crisis, because suddenly they realize how much they don't know, right, and that science can't prove to them.
Well, I think science has been our new religion in a lot of, for a lot of people's lives who have discarded traditional religions. And then when they have an experience like this, their whole reality is shattered.
Yeah. Its experience is undeniable.
Yeah.
You can read stuff, you can be told stuff, but until you have experience, it will not embed. And once it embeds, you can't unlearn that.
Totally. Yeah. I think I found ways for me in between the peak experiences. When I first started, working with some of these compounds as well, like you in between, ultra rationalist and like, oh, that was just some, one-time thing. You have an experience and you go, oh, nope, same stuff.
Yeah.
It comes up again. But now just for me, meditating and being in nature and like silence, solitude by myself, those two things keep me sort of above water, so to speak. And I think everybody has their own path and their own way that they can get there and be more conscious and aware.
Well, and we've noticed, my wife and I have both noticed that we can actually spontaneously get into those states, the feeling states of the empathogens or the psychedelics, not in the space of tripping on these things, but in the space of that beautiful feeling of when you're in it. This is why most of these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and great idea people, they microdose LSD, they microdose psilocybin, because it does open the mind to those states. And I think once you start integrating these into your human state, you can instantaneously drop into those feelings, and you no longer need the medications or the psychedelics. You just start to have it. And sometimes the microdosing is enough to boost you, to give you that little tweak of the experience and to remember it. And I think we're going to see a real revolution coming here in the next couple of years, for sure. The immortality key that we talked about prior to this interview. Christianity being founded on psychedelics, and the Roman Catholic Church going in and blocking it after they got tired of the women doing communion and they called them witches. And this is where all the Greek philosophers would spend their summers, is in this temple of Eleusis, and they would just come up with amazing ideas and stories and just grow. The growth of the human race was huge when that was happening.
Yeah, so it sounds like we might be on a precipice of something similar.
Yeah, I think we are.
Well, Doc, thanks for all your work and doing a complex work of integrating everything. I really appreciate it. Where can people find
the interview?
Yeah, where can people find a lot of the stuff that you're working on?
So they can go to apeironzoe.com. That's our corporate site that talks about everything that we do. It's apeironzoh.com. And that's Greek for limitless life.
Okay. Thanks, Doc. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.